Okay. Hi, this is on Shock Exchange, and this is Trump and the GE, where we discuss the president's policies and how they affect the economy and the community. And I always have Torian Mitchell with me. So we're asking people who watch this video on YouTube to subscribe to the channel, like the videos, and share the videos so we can get this information out to as many people as possible. We know people are watching the videos and listening, so we ask that you share the information as well. As you know, over the past couple of weeks, we've been discussing how low Endo's share price has been hit with a so-called opiate overhang, but we think it's likely more due to manipulation because these opiate trials are beginning to materialize and settlements are beginning to materialize. So it seems like there's definitely a pathway for Endo to settle its opiate litigation. We know that Johnson & Johnson, the big opiate distributors, have settled. Mallinckrodt, Purdue Pharma settled. Endo settled with New York, which we thought would be pretty cantankerous, but they settled for $50 million. They settled with Louisiana. They also settled with several counties in Tennessee, municipalities in Tennessee. So the stock still is very low, and we think it's manipulated by short sellers. Stock is highly shorted and still trades around 6 times EBITDA, which is criminal. In our opinion, we think Endo should be buying back shares hand over fist. We think they're probably buying back stock. We won't know just how much they spent on buybacks until, I'd say, Q3 earnings come out, which could be the first or second week of November. In the meantime, we think the company could be vulnerable to takeovers or someone buying its shares on the cheap. Could be an activist investor, or there could be big pharma who's already in the aesthetic space or want to be in the aesthetic space, and want to double down on somebody who wants access to a very attractive industry that's growing in double digits, and also to piggyback on Endo's R&D. So to get started, so this week we'll give you an update about what's going on with the company. There have been several new developments other than the opiate settlements. The company announced generic Chantix, which we think is a big deal. It could be Endo's second largest product behind Vasostrict, and could eventually overtake Vasostrict in a few quarters. Then also there was news about the California trial, California opiate trial with a few counties involving Teva, AbbVie, Endo. I also think maybe Johnson & Johnson. I'm not sure, but the judge recently gave a statement that he has seen a dearth of evidence to support the plaintiff's claims that a proliferation of opiate prescriptions or the opiate manufacturers cause inappropriate prescriptions to be written. So the case that the plaintiffs are making is that the proliferation of opiate pills over the past decade or so led to an opiate epidemic. That may have not been the case, but we all know that these doctors have been prescribing opiates for chronic pain, which they hadn't been previously, had been used for critical care cancer patients, and also for people who had surgery. Then they began prescribing for chronic pain. So that means the prescriptions spiraled upward. That caused more addiction, and it may have led to the opiate epidemic in some respects. But the judge said that everybody knew that they were prescribing for chronic pain, and the trade-off may have been more addiction. In the case the plaintiffs have had to make is that the opiate manufacturers were the ones who caused doctors to prescribe inappropriately, make more prescriptions for opiates, and they haven't proven that yet. So I think it may have been a shot across the bow that, first of all, if these opiate manufacturers can get a victory in court, that could I think it could be a shot across the bow. It could be a message to other jurisdictions that you can't get a public nuisance claim in these examples. And Judge Polster also threw cold water on the idea. You likely will not be able to get a public nuisance claim in court. Said that a couple years ago. So this is really a negotiation it's not a legal process. It's a negotiation. It's a public policy issue. And it's not a legal issue. It should be more negotiation that that we have to bring these manufacturers, the defendants and the plaintiffs to the table and negotiate something where the defendants can pay money to help fund settlements, help fund treatment and prevention without going bankrupt. And the municipalities can get money for an opiate epidemic. That seems to be where we're hitting it. It could go that direction if the judge rules that these defendants are innocent, and it could force other municipalities to come to the table and get what they can get. California could say we'll try to get what we can get from a settlement. That we won't play hardball. We'll try to get what we can get, and other municipalities may come to the table and say we're willing to settle, which is what Louisiana did preemptively. From what I understand, Louisiana may have reached out to Teva and Endo to kind of try to get a deal done. And it was very quick, and they all came to an agreement to get money to Louisiana so they can, fund treatment and prevention. So that may be the case if this judge rules in favor of the defendants, or if the state AG in California preempts a judgment instead of settle this at a low amount. So I think we may have seen a shot across the bow last week from the judge in California, and that's sort of my opinion. It may be a lot of demarcation for opiate litigation, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean it's been a busy week to say the least, and I think just to put it in the most plainest terms, the lawyers, essentially the plaintiffs' lawyers, which frankly, I find it an admonishment by the judge that they've built a case that lacks evidence. I mean, to me, that's other than just calling you stupid, that's kind of a nice way of saying it. That with such a not only a high profile case, but a case that impacts real people and real outcomes. It's not just about states and counties getting money, but it's about real people at the end of this trial and at the end of these negotiations. That again, as I continue to kind of stand on my soapbox, so to speak, to always try to bring it back down to reality. Is that you have people that really need access to those resources at the end of the day, especially for treatment, those that are already going through treatment, those that are still seeking treatment, and those that have yet to engage with some form of treatment because they're still dealing with the addiction phase of addiction. So this isn't just kind of a high level conversation. And when you frame it that way, and to let the lawyers know, the plaintiffs lawyers know that, hey, you're lacking evidence for a case that you've watched over the last 2 years. Like let's bring this back again to reality that this is not a short process. You've already watched Tennessee. You've watched Oklahoma, you've watched Ohio, you've watched the state AG who has led the charge across the country for the rest of the AGs. You've watched Letitia James out of New York also settle with Endo. So it's like you've had many examples. You've had the same amount of access to the same amount of information. And your argument is that doctors didn't know heroin was addictive? Like this is the argument that you're making. It's just that's a goofy argument. in front of a courtroom making such an argument. Who doesn't know heroin is addictive? Who doesn't know that cocaine isn't addictive? Who didn't know that fentanyl was addictive. Who didn't know that? You would have a very hard time to prove that doctors were not giving warnings to their patients. I don't know of any person that ever said, even those that were dissatisfied with their doctor's recommendations, even those that were dissatisfied with the fact that maybe they felt that they didn't get enough pain medication, especially after like a surgery, because kind of the difference, and it's important to denote some of those terms, but that biggest difference that you heard between like pain coming from surgery, pain coming from an acute event such as, say, an accident, like a severe car accident, is what's known as breakthrough pain. So meaning that we've surpassed the everyday ailments and everyday pain that you may be accustomed to within your life or surrounding your condition, and has gotten to a point where it's unbearable. So it's considered now breakthrough pain. And these prescriptions were being prescribed specifically for breakthrough pain. And when those prescriptions are written, typically, whether you're getting a conversation by the nurse, whether you're getting a conversation by the nurse practitioner, the PA, the physician themselves, typically, now maybe there are some outliers out there, but typically there comes some type of advice with taking said medication, such as don't take it with alcohol, don't take it, don't operate heavy machinery, don't drive, certainly don't take it outside of the realm of which it's prescribed. So, if it's something that's taken every 6 hours, 8 hours, 4 hours, don't take two before that time period is up, in other words. And certainly along with those lines, is that the reasoning or the logic behind it is that, these pain medications that are, let's be clear, narcotics at the end of the day, that they can be addictive. And these are things that even prior to the opioid crisis, doctors and the healthcare industry has been dealing with for decades. The ability to tell between a patient that is truly in need of pain treatment and those that are addiction seeking. And it's a fine line, and it's a challenge, but it's something that physicians, their various academies, the entire healthcare industry has been addressing for decades. So this isn't a new conversation. It's not a new reality by any stretch of the imagination. And yet you have plaintiffs' lawyers that are standing up and pretty much proclaiming the opposite. So you're going to have a significant burden of proof on your hands to show that across the country, we're not talking about one or two outliers here. I think that would be very different if it was one physician, one doctor's office that had bad practices. Does that happen? I'm certain that there are. There's always folks that end up falling through the cracks. But this is not what we're talking about. We're talking about an entire system. You're talking about every physician that has ever written a script for an opioid. You're saying that every physician, it almost gets into the argument that you often hear in the social justice space of, all cops are bad, right? And I think it would be kind of warranted if, physicians were, killing folks left, right, and center, right? Now, how will we make that distinction between good physicians and bad physicians then? And is there any recourse? And certainly there's a significantly larger recourse for a physician, such as if a physician is found guilty of malpractice, even negligence, if they have murdered a patient, guess what they can't do? They can't go to another physician's office. They can't move across county and state lines and simply just get another job as a physician. They can't do that. So there are significantly higher consequences for physicians. So in other words, you are going to have to show a significantly high pattern of behavior, not just across one or two bad apples, but across an entire system. So yeah, it seems pretty stupid to make such an argument and claim. Offline, we've had this conversation, and just to me, it even seems silly to even have J&J, Teva, and Endo really wrapped up in the same, because there's kind of a connotation there. Certainly in the public's eye, maybe legally, the distinctions are being made within the courtrooms themselves. However, clearly J&J has had a larger complicity than Endo. And to be very clear again, Endo took Aparna, which was their opioid drug, off of the shelves in 2017. Endo just got, they ended up appealing, but Johnson & Johnson was the first fire shot with a $585 million judgment set against them. And if you think that Endo is in the same category as Johnson & Johnson, which was still moving opioids, still marketing opioids, and Endo had stopped marketing opioids, had even stopped selling opioids 4 years ago, I think 5 years ago at this point. So they were ahead of the curve. When we talk about civil cases, understand that what you're really hoping to define is the scope of injury. Once you define that scope of injury, then comes the price tag attached to that scope of injury. So looking at, it's the difference between someone stepping on your toe and, someone hitting you with a car. And, the difference between Endo is that, Endo stepped on your toe. Did it cause harm? Because maybe they stepped on your toe with a steel toe boot. Did it hurt? Yes, it did. Did they cause some harm? Yes, it did. When they stepped on your toe, did they stop stepping on your toe? They did. When Johnson & Johnson hit you with the car, did they continue hitting you with the car? They did. They put the vehicle in reverse. They ran over your torso. They made sure to put it back in drive and then run over your legs and then put it back in reverse to make sure they ran over your arms. It didn't miss. So in other words, the harm continued year in and year out. This is the same argument that was made against Purdue, rightfully so, because they continued engaging in the harm even after knowing full well what was happening on the ground. They were seeing the complaints. They were hearing the complaints even from physicians and other healthcare professionals. This was the same case against INSIS. In other words, you now knew that you hit someone with your vehicle. Not only did you hit someone with your vehicle, you didn't get out, exchange information, apologize, and do the right thing. You hit someone with your vehicle, doubled back, and continued hitting them over and over again. This is the difference. So to even kind of couple them in the same, case, to me, it even weakens the argument. In other words, it weakens the approach by the plaintiffs that you are trying to argue that an Endo is the same as a Johnson & Johnson. And while to the general public, that may seem like minutia, but I promise you legally, it is not minutia at all. It is a significant point. And I think that this is why you're seeing the different outcomes for Endo versus Johnson & Johnson versus Purdue versus Cardinal Health and other manufacturers and distributors of opioids. So it's not a small thing, not by a long shot. So, yeah, I think that on two fronts, in other words, California has pigeonholed themselves into a pretty weak corner, and that they have to fight tooth and nail to kind of get out of. Obviously, I'm not a lawyer here, so I can only speak from my understanding of what's happening and the conversations that I'm having behind the scenes. But I would have to agree that they have painted themselves in a pretty tight corner here. And looking at the examples, especially most recently of Louisiana, 7.5 million, maybe there was broader harm done to more counties within the state of California, just being a bigger state than Louisiana. However, I am not seeing that it would be a very much different outcome in terms of a bigger settlement than New York or Tennessee. If I remember correctly, Tennessee actually had the most counties across the country. I believe Tennessee and West Virginia that were the most affected. So if your state does not have as many counties affected as Tennessee or West Virginia, and Tennessee settled for 35 million as well. So in other words, there's plenty of precedent that has been set. There's plenty of examples that have been set where you can make a reasonable judgment as to what is the most winnable here. And if you are not using those things to set your precedent in terms of what is the best strategy, how can we get this settled and frankly quickly, but at an amount where the state doesn't feel cheated, it pinches a little bit. I mean, let's be very real and again, apply some common sense that typically in a negotiation is going to hurt on both sides. But also both sides are going to get a little bit of what they want. I think that's the most ideal scenario. And we've already taken off the table the amount of harm and injury that has been done. So in other words, the pinching or the pain from negotiation has kind of been taken off the table a little bit for Endo as compared to a Purdue, an instance, a Johnson & Johnson, for example, or even a Teva for that matter. Endo is the smallest perpetrator across all of the biopharmas that have been named as a part of the opioid crisis. So in other words, some of that ammunition that you could have used to drop the hammer on Endo has been taken off the table. And I think this is the reason why we're seeing the outcomes for the amounts that we are seeing, because at the end of the day, AGs still have to contend with reality that if the goal, and again, if the goal, and I will continue to repeat that, if the goal is to get state and county coffers filled in order for the treatment and prevention to address the current opioid crisis, then your approach to this negotiation should be, what is the most winnable here? What can we get out of this that is the most winnable? Looking at the precedents that have been set, looking at what judges in previous states have done, looking at what AGs were able to do in previous states as well. However, if your goal is to politicize this for your political climbing, then we get into a different ball game. And unfortunately, we saw that. We saw what happened with New York State, that, a whole soapbox marketing campaign was built around politicizing the opioid crisis. And not even a week prior to the settlement, we see it comes out, as I've stated here before, that The state AG was pushing for a gubernatorial run, is having conversations behind the scenes, looking at donors to see who would be willing to back her if she had a gubernatorial run. And in her listings, what I found most interesting, and in her listings of the things that she would stand on as accomplishments that she brought before the state and have done in the name of the people of the state of New York, guess what was not listed? The opioid crisis.
Opiates?
Endo. He did a whole marketing campaign about how you're going to bring justice to folks, and yet, it was a tweet that came out. There was no mention. They mentioned going after the Trump organization, which has yet to shake out in terms of outcome. Trump still out free, still campaigning, looking at a 2024 run, and so far has some very strong polling numbers. I believe the most recent poll showed him at a 60% approval rate if he were to run in 2024 again. So in other words, when we look at, which outcome was closer? Trump getting and the organization going, getting indicted and going to prison, or Endo getting settled? Which thing would you mention in your press release of a gubernatorial run? I would think the thing that you've actually accomplished, or the thing that had a better chance of closing, in other words, which was the Endo settlement. Yet you completely leave it out of your list of accomplishments. I think maybe when you look at that 50 million, was it 13.5 million that went to state AG's office? Maybe, I guess, as far as what was being tossed around in terms of numbers, and I'm sure some part of that was ego a bit as well. When ego is involved and your ego gets a bit deflated because the reality of the outcome differs from what you were hoping for, then it begins to make sense why you didn't mention this in your list of accomplishments. So in other words, this is the type of outcome when you politicize. When you politicize public policy, when you politicize real outcomes for real people. These are not just political points, and people should not be treated like political fodder. And when you begin to politicize a real addiction crisis that is happening nationwide, and that's impacting other parts of the world as well, so it's not just in the U.S., when you politicize addiction, this is the outcome. In other words, right. So I hope that is not what AGs in California are doing. I hope that they are keeping their eyes on the ball and are regrouping and are asking themselves what is winnable here, and most importantly, what is winnable for the people that actually need these resources. And I think that they will find themselves at a similar point that Tennessee, Ohio, Oklahoma, New York, Louisiana have found themselves as well, and got it closed, got a deal done, and got checks cut and written to those states and counties, social services organizations, treatment organizations, and prevention organizations. Okay, those are all fair points. I mean, I think there's clearly, politics involved here. I've thought that since Oklahoma settled, several counties and Ohio settled, I think State AG Dave Yost and Governor Mike DeWine did a great job of getting these cases settled and negotiating, coming up with a settlement mechanism with the counties and municipalities to make sure they got their fair share, and to be transparent about how much was going to state coffers, how much was going to actual counties and cities that were harmed, and how much was going to treatment and prevention centers. And I thought that everybody else would fall in line. That hadn't happened. That has not happened. After the pandemic was over, now these states want to go to court, which I was shocked by. And the state AG of New York
put out some type of press release to the extent that the eyes of the world are going to be on New York.
Right.
They're going to show what these opiate manufacturers did. Like, it was like a lot of big fanfare, and the state AG's office and also the plaintiff's lawyers seemed like they were treating it like they wanted to be Johnny Cochran and F. Lee Bailey and have their day in the sun. Well, I thought they were gonna try to find a way to settle and get money into the hands of these centers for treatment and prevention. So it was a little cantankerous, in my opinion. A lot of bombastic press releases about headshots and sort of Damocles. But again, nobody has not one doctor has said that these opiate manufacturers made me write a prescription, or I didn't know what I was writing. I didn't know the opiates were addictive. Not one doctor said that, which is the case that claim that the state AGs are making. Not one. I don't know if a patient has said I took opiates because they were there.
Right.
Because there was so much in supply, I took it. Because and just because drugs are in supply doesn't mean people take it. And just because you cut supply doesn't mean you're going to reduce addiction or reduce use. You have to quell the demand side. And a lot of things leading to demand, as we spoke previously, lack of hope and so on and so forth. Until you deal with that, you're going to have people still turning to drugs and turning to opiates. And again, opiate overdose deaths, drug overdose deaths are still going to the roofs, and opiate overdose deaths, as a percentage of that, has been consistent.
Yeah.
I think Donald Trump threw down a gauntlet in 2017, said, we're going to bring these opiate manufacturers to justice and make sure they pay their fair share. And it was one of those few things that I think both sides, Democrats and Republicans, agreed on. And Donald Trump threw down a gauntlet, said, this is what we're going to do. And people followed his lead. And nobody's ever given Trump credit for that. That's probably one thing that everybody agreed upon that Trump was behind.
Yeah. Yep.
And nobody's ever mentioned the guy's name. So when he threw down the gauntlet, that means there's no political cap. You don't lose any political capital by going after opiate manufacturers. But previously, it wasn't popular.
Yeah.
It wasn't popular in 2010 or 2011 to say we're going to sue opiate manufacturers. Matter of fact, policymakers protected Purdue Pharma, who was the worst actor in all this. So again, everybody knew what these opiate manufacturers were doing. They know they know about the proliferation of opiate prescriptions. They know doctors were writing prescriptions for chronic pain. Nobody said a word.
Yep.
Now all of a sudden, everybody's playing pretend like they didn't know what was going on, and it's the opiate manufacturer's fault. But you didn't lose any political capital by going after the opiate manufacturers in court. However, now that we get down to the brass tacks, people have settled, the big boys have settled, and now a judge in California is questioning the claims from plaintiffs. Now, if you're state AG, is this the hill you want to die on? And at some point, I think you can become a nuisance to the public. I think these plaintiffs' lawyers and state AGs have become a nuisance to the public. Settle these claims, get funding, and get the money to treatment and prevention, which you said it was for all along, which is the sole purpose. And it seemed like there's a rudderless process now that Judge Polster, some of his power has been taken away from him. But when he was sort of leading the charge, it was a lot of common sense talk. He was corralling these guys to get in to negotiate a deal. Now that he's not as involved now, it seems like a rudderless process, and people are kind of doing what they want. This is not what Judge Polster wanted. But anyway, this is the hill you want to die on if you are a state AG. And secondly, if after the statement from the judge in California, if you're the plaintiff's lawyers, if you're Seeger Weiss or Motley Rice, how do you go to the state of Illinois or the state of Wisconsin, West Virginia or other states, beating the drum about opiate addiction and about we're going to bring these people to justice when a judge in California has already told you?
Right.
That's the dearth of information. And the judge in judge in Oklahoma who ruled against Johnson & Johnson, that state is very specific to Oklahoma, but their public nuisance laws are much broader in definition than other states. So that may have been driven that judgment against Johnson & Johnson, which they eventually appealed. Okay, so that being said, one more thing happened last week. Merck has shown that it had an oral solution for to treat COVID-19 for people who have contracted COVID-19 and treat them once they become hospitalized. That is shown to be highly effective. And you saw stocks for Gilead, Moderna, BioNTech, Pfizer, Novavax turned down. I think Pfizer actually ended up, but the other companies turned down. So I think it's going to definitely affect Gilead and Regeneron, who have treatments, who treat patients once they become hospitalized. But Moderna and Novavax shares also fell hard.
Yeah.
My guess is that if this pill works, if people think it's going to be a game changer, it could potentially keep people from getting COVID a second time or a third time, which could reduce, further reduce demand for vaccinations, for vaccines.
And boosters primarily too.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. So, Novavax, if Novavax, I think the time has turned, I think there could be a line of demarcation where Novavax's shares and Moderna shares just can't rise because they're rising. They can't keep going up because the Fed is printing money and buying stocks with it. So those companies, we've said loudly that they have to find a way to diversify their revenue. Novavax's vaccine has not even received emergency use authorization. Merck's pill could receive oral treatment could receive emergency use authorization before Novavax.
And yet Novavax again in the 200s. Make that that make sense.
Yeah, but Novavax was again it's a startup operation, so it started from nothing.
That's the problem.
So it had to build facilities, testing facilities, and manufacturing facilities. And so we know they have to diversify their revenue, which means that it should be looking at Endo in terms of a company that's undervalued in this market, which is like a unicorn, and or an oxymoron, really. So it's really something hard to find. And then again, Novavax has a relationship with Endo in that they've engaged Endo to help with fill finish manufacturing services for Novavax's vaccine to help fill the vaccines and fill the vials and to distribute the vaccines to customers and municipalities. So they may have pole position again if Novavax or Moderna beat the big pharma to the punch in terms of investing in Endo. These two companies were not even around a year ago. They beat big pharma to the punch. Then, the M&A departments of these big pharma companies who know about Endo and is attracting them, they should be fired immediately. So I'll leave it at that. Okay. So that's a good segue
into our Barbarian number 6. I was thinking about,
exactly.
I don't know if we mentioned it last time, but just as a quick note that, Pfizer CEO has, come out and made that statement that they foresee, getting back to a sense of normalcy, and I think especially for Pfizer itself, after next year. So in other words, I think that's the pronouncement that they are also recognizing that they must diversify their revenue, because they can't just continue eating off of, COVID government checks. So yeah, I think that's just, kind of a good segue into our Barbarian number 6, man.
Right. Yeah, and that's a fair point, but also in the fact that at some point, Pfizer's COVID vaccine will peak, if it hasn't peaked already, but they're also going to get hit by Chantix, which is $1 billion market. So they pulled Chantix totally off the market.
Yeah.
So at this point, it could be Endo's market all to itself. So that I'm not sure those numbers are already already built into Pfizer's share price, but it's something that they definitely have to speak to on the next earnings call. Why generic Chantix revenue fell so hard, and was expected maybe fall even harder in the future.
Yeah.
So I think everything is being overshadowed by just how much money they're making from the COVID from the vaccine. But at some point, once the vaccine revenue peaked, people started looking at reality that Pfizer will have to find a way to, and Big Pharma in general have to find a way to grow revenue, and then also Pfizer will have to explain the decline in Chantix revenue. But Barbarian number 6 is a big pharma company, has about generated about $14 billion in revenue in Q2, up 34%. year over year. Over 40% of its revenue comes from immunology, which grew 11%, which is great for this company because when your largest product is growing at double-digit rates, that's a good thing. Probably due largely to price hikes as well. Yeah. At some point, price hikes will dissipate, and will become a political football. So you can't keep going through price hikes or acquisitions, shall we say? Because that's those events are kind of ethereal, in my opinion. Oncology represents about 13% of total revenue and grew 14%. Aesthetics was about 10% of total revenue and grew 187%. That's likely through acquisitions. And its neuroscience business is growing like bad weeds, represents about 11% of total revenue, and it grew 99% year over year. So it has a aesthetics presence. It's been aggressive in the aesthetics market. It bought a big player in the aesthetics market a year ago. We won't say the name, but it likely bought that company because both companies, Barbarian number 6 and the target company's revenue was slowing, and they couldn't keep growing through price hikes. So they had to find a way to grow. So they combined and then cut costs. That's one way to grow the bottom line. So even though revenue may not be growing as rapidly as in previous years, but it's a way you can grow operating income and pre-tax income through cost cuts and through the benefits of scale.
Yep.
On the combined, I think we call Endo aesthetics business. I call it Quo and Xiaflex. And Quo, again, is nascent, which is not in these numbers. The fact that it can actually grow revenue up to $1 billion, but right now it's pretty nascent. It's only been reported in Endo's earnings or revenue in Q2. So it's in a startup phase, and its revenue should grow in leaps and bounds. But Endo's Q2 revenue is about $119 million and grew 250% year over year. And part of that was due to the fact that we're coming out of the pandemic, and as people return to doctor's offices, you see a more use of Xiaflex. But Xiaflex is expected to grow 40%, expected to grow in double-digit range over time as people become more aware of non-surgical options for Peyronie's disease and Dupuytren's contracture. And then you have Quo growing, was expected to grow in leaps and bounds. And on a combined basis, Xiaflex will represent about 8% of Barbarian's combined aesthetics business. But Barbarian number 6 has been very aggressive in the aesthetic space. It bought a big aesthetics business a year ago. It just recently bought a body contouring company that does body contouring. So they are aware of how rapidly the aesthetic space is growing. They want a piece of that. And there's no reason they won't go after Endo, especially at these prices. Company's highly undervalued. There's no guarantee that Barbarian number 6 won't pull the trigger again. It has enough capital. There's no guarantee it won't pull the trigger again if not only to grow in this study space, but to defend its current business against a company like Endo that has potential for a blockbuster treatment in Quo, and the potential to continue to expand the hospitals and to build relationships with doctors to introduce other products in the aesthetic space over time that could compete heavily in the space. So I think Barbarian number 6 is a real candidate to take an investment in Endo, specifically at these prices. It has the capital, it has the appetite, and it has a core competency in M&A, which is key. So they have a competency to structure a deal where they can take a large stake in Endo today and then try to buy the rest as the opiate overhang subsides. So we think Endo could be vulnerable, particularly at these prices. They should be buying shares hand over fist to try to get its share price closer to fair value. So that's my take on that.
I think Barbarian, honestly, I almost want to say Barbarian number 6 probably, at least in my opinion, should be at least top 2, because Barbarian number 6 is and it's really a household name, but it's also the intersection of two really colliding events, and also a tertiary event that is adding pressure on the previous two colliding events. And the first event as you stated, was the immunology sector. It has a significant stake in the immunology sector, one of its biggest revenue earners, and primarily because when you look at the immunizations, and especially through childhood immunizations, so this is where it gets into some of the threatening of the revenue. So, within the last 5 or 6 years, there has been significant eyeballs on the rising cost of healthcare, which I feel like, I feel like I'm just so redundant every week in mentioning that. I guess I will continue to be until it reverses. So until healthcare costs start declining. But as a result of that, not only was it an awareness of price hikes within the industry, but immunizations have actually been able to go a little bit under the radar, and primarily because for parents or guardians, essentially folks that raise children, even if they aren't their own or their biological children, if you are a parent and if you raise a child, especially within the Western Hemisphere, every child goes through a similar process. Location will typically kind of determine where in that process certain immunizations will become relevant. However, the process is largely the same. Children under the age of 5 years old go through an immunization track. This is where you get that yellow, if you remember your school days, you got that yellow immunization card that you had to take with you to school for some. But in other words, children have to get an immunization track. Because children have to get an immunization track, and this is where we get the argument of the anti-vaxxers versus the vaxxers, but it has been largely from a conversation or debate around the utility of that particular vaccine. What's in it, the potential harm that's done, efficacy within a child's growth and development over time, et cetera, et cetera. So it's been largely a medical debate. It has oddly enough, the less, the less aware or the less talked about part of that debate is the price of said immunizations. And I think one, largely because parents, most parents that do have insurance obviously use their insurance, but even parents that don't have insurance, because you're dealing with children and immunizations for children attach pretty much to most of their interactions in life. In order for your child to get in daycare, in order for your children to get in almost any educational program, so whether it's school or even what's known as latchkey programs, they need to show their immunizations. Even when it comes to summer school programs, whether they're sports, football, basketball, baseball, even in academically driven summer programs, you need immunizations. So because immunizations for children attached to pretty much every sector in their life, there are different programs that cover costs. States help cover costs for those immunization shots to lower the cost, and in some instances cover the cost completely. So in other words, the cost of those immunizations can really go undiscussed. However, because of rising cost and because of the rising awareness, especially amongst one of the largest voting bases in the country and the most vocal voting bases in the country, middle-class moms. Like, this is who biopharma is up against. And while, it may seem like, they're just, a cacophony of women on Facebook, blah, blah. Like, listen, don't take that voter base for granted at all. Like, it is, whether you agree with the points that they're making or not, doesn't matter. We are talking about the power that voter base has, and one of the
not to cut you off, but would the power of that voting base be reflective in the fact that we have all these state AGs getting their dander up over an opiate epidemic?
It could certainly be argued. It could certainly be argued. I think one of the first, one of the first examples of how vocal that voter base is I believe, and for the feminists out there, don't kill me if I'm getting it wrong, but I believe it was the second wave of feminism. The first being suffragette movements. So prior to them being an actual voting base, which was focused on getting the vote, which was accomplished in the U.S. In 1920, 1921. Whereas non-white women, majority black women, had to wait a whole other 40 plus years to get their ability to vote, although they participated in the suffragette movement. Shouts out to IDB Wells. But the point is
so it wasn't for all women. It wasn't for all women.
Apparently not. Apparently,
I find that hard to believe.
That's what we call.
I find that hard to believe. Right.
However, point being is that in that second wave of feminism, we kind of coined it or demark it by one of the more widely known and widely published books, The Feminine Mystique, which was throughout the 60s and 70s, where we saw the rise of the collectivism of women across the country and making their voices heard, both politically and economically as well. Well, that voter base has only strengthened in the subsequent decades, which brings us here. That as there is more of a focus on price hikes throughout the industry, and especially when it comes to things that affect their children, it's only a matter of time, in other words, before that becomes an issue for Barbarian number 6. So that's really the first threat to the immunological section that is a significant driver of their revenue. They understand that threat, and which was already underway when we saw Martin Shkreli, when we saw the outrage over EpiPen prices that have jacked up over 1,200%. So in other words, it's only a matter of time before we see another rise. And with that focus going to be on the price of immunizations. So that is the first threat, in other words. Now, the second, threat of that, well, because of that first threat, brings us into the second threat, is that obviously this is the point of you having economists, of you having an M&A team. The larger you are as an organization, the more you want to have a crystal ball to be able to predict the future, because you want your revenue to be as consistent as possible. And that consistency really being the basement of where you want the revenue to go, with the hopes being that it will continue to grow from that point. So because of that, when there's a threat to lowering the basement, and as we just identified, a significant threat that is waiting in the wings to take their basement a notch down, which means that now you're forced to look at other ways of how do you recoup potential losses. This is where the aesthetics business steps in. Quo is going to be, they'd already made as you alluded to, made an acquisition last year, one of the most recognizable names in the aesthetic space. In fact, Quo will arguably be sold right next to this product that Barbarian number 6 purchased. And as we stated, because it has been on the market for so long, at this point, it only focuses on discretionary income. This is not a needs-based product. Only within the last few months, in fact, there have been some scholarship showing that there may be another need for that product. However, the length of time that it'll take for that product to proliferate on that basis is a different argument. Whereas you already have Quo that is kills two birds with one stone, that not only from an aesthetic purpose that drives the growth of sales, but also the fact that it has a medicinal purpose. That when you look at cellulite, it not only is something unwanted from, again, an aesthetic reason, but it also affects folks' overall health as well. So, in other words, which makes more sense? Do you wait for the existing or the incumbent product that's already on the shelves that is already saturated the market? In other words, there's not too much room for this product to grow beyond the numbers that is already doing. You become, like I've stated before, you become Shaq, you become the Hulk driving a Mini Cooper. You're hitting your head on the ceiling, your shoulders, your elbows, you're trying to bust out of this thing because you've grown beyond the limit of the market to allow you to keep growing, especially at double-digit numbers. So which makes more sense? Do you wait for this thing to hopefully hit some point where you grow beyond at double-digit numbers, or do you scoop up the newcomer that is already growing in high double-digit numbers and will only grow even more, especially when it's sitting right next to your existing product and being able to equally compete? And again, in my opinion, given the same time period, which their existing product has had a few decades to do. So over that same time period, I see Quo blowing the incumbent out of the water when we compare the amount of growth that it is going to experience over that same time period. So which makes more sense? The other thing is, in that last tertiary event that's happening, is the Fed said party's over. And that we have less than a year to completely end QE. So what does that mean? What does that mean for the value of corporations, especially corporations that are largely under debt, largely in their eyeballs in debt, largely at their cap at growth with their existing products and services line? The fact that wages are not keeping up with the rate of inflation. CPI, as we stand right now, is close to 5.7%, when CPI typically is anywhere from 2 to kind of 2.5%. So CPI alone is already twice its normal rate. So understanding that, in other words, once the Fed cuts off the party, and it's already starting to cut off the party, we're already starting to see the effects within the market, that we're going to see a correction. And not just from a market perspective, but in real life, that your groceries are going to be going up, your gas is going to be going up. In some instances, rent is going to be going up even more. Rent is already up 14, 15% on average across the country. Housing values are already up over 20%. So in other words, we're only going to see these numbers continue to go up on a very real basis. So in other words, if I'm Barbarian number 6 and the product that's sitting on my shelf is already just something that is dependent upon discretionary income, but I'm looking at discretionary income's future, decline very rapidly, very quickly in terms of a timeline, and is already a threat to my immunization business, what becomes a great way to diversify said revenue? In other words, that does not have to depend solely upon discretionary income, and you can still address your existing aesthetic market. So this is the reason why it's really that Venn diagram of all three of those events happening simultaneously that I say that Barbarian number 6 is an extremely strong candidate for scooping up Endo for pennies on the dollar.
Right. Those are all fair points. I mean, Barbarian number 6 largest product is being hit by is either being hit by competition from biosimilars or is expected to be hit by competition from biosimilars. And people had already been complaining about price hikes previously.
Right.
To dominate the market. So you have companies that if you have winners in the healthcare space, instead of continuing to invest in R&D with an uncertain outcome, they're just hiking prices on their winners.
Right.
They're hiking, and if you're a publicly traded company, the reality is that they're going to hike prices. They're publicly traded, and their revenue's growing at high single-digit rates or double-digit rates. They're going to continue to tell investors that we're going to continue to grow at high single-digit rates or double-digit rates, and we'll hike prices if we have to get there. And people are complaining about Barbarian number 6 hiking prices for its top treatment. And it wasn't going to go down. It's not going to go down unless somebody makes it go down. And so competition from biosimilars could do that. But the price hikes are going to remain a political football, especially as the economy turns down and prices for food and what we call, and economists call elastic goods, like food and rent, things that you have to pay for, gasoline, go up. They have to pay for those. You're going to have people more complaints about runaway drug costs.
Yeah.
Not because people aren't hiking prices for drugs because they want to fund R&D. They're hiking prices for drugs because they need to justify their inflated stock prices.
Yeah.
So it's going to become a point of contention. So you have to diversify your revenue. You have to grow through acquisitions. Barbarian number 6 has already sent a signal that it will defend its aesthetic space. That's why they bought into the body contouring space. They acquired a company in body contouring. Quo also addresses body contouring. And management thinks that companies in the body contouring space could be vulnerable. Hologic sold its body contouring business to a private equity firm because Endo's Quo is expected to do damage in that space. I think Bausch Health has a company, has a segment that does body contouring. I think it also is vulnerable. It's less talked about, but I think it's definitely vulnerable. So Quo is expected to be revolutionary. You can get a cellulite treatment and a body contouring treatment in one fell swoop. Is expected to disrupt the aesthetic space in general, not just cellulite, but the entire aesthetics industry.
Yep. And
Endo has the product to do it. They have the management team to do it. They have the sales force to do it, and they're coming with more products. So I think Barbarian number 6 was smart to continue to buy into the aesthetic space and try to defend its position. It's also we're only talking about $1 billion in revenue. We're only talking about the U.S. sales. It doesn't include international sales. So Endo is looking for a partner to expand internationally. Barbarian number 6 was a couple years ago was quoted by analysts as a potential partner to help Endo expand into Europe. So these two companies know each other. They both know the aesthetic space. And Barbarian number 6 knows exactly who Endo is. And they're probably going to partner they have the potential to partner at some point, either a distribution agreement to help Endo expand into Europe or a strategic investment in Endo by Barbarian number 6 to continue to defend its aesthetics business, which is going to become key going forward because it's not the price is not regulated. And then secondly, if nothing else, to keep a competitor from buying Endo and expanding into the aesthetic space and become a bigger, provide more capital to Endo, more relationships as far as hospitals and so on and so forth, and be somebody who could help Endo expand into Europe. Again, I think that if these big pharma companies let Novavax or Moderna beat them to the punch, the M&A department should be fired. And aesthetics, Barbarian number 6 will have a lot of questions to answer if Novavax or Moderna invest in Endo, or if a competitor invests in Endo and get access to the aesthetic space and help Endo expand into Europe, something that Barbarian number 6 should have done already. So it's going to have a lot of questions to answer. So this is not, for, again, we're doing the type of research that, again, Reginald Lewis would have done, Ivan Boesky would have done, and Dennis Levine, who's going to be in, we're going to highlight in this YouTube segment for this video, who used to work on Wall Street, and he was part of Insider Trading Ring with Boesky and Michael Milken. This is the type of Dennis Levine will be chattering on Wall Street right now, chattering to other brokers and other M&A teams that put Endo in play. So this is a deal he would love, something that had some hair on it, something that had some headline risk, but they could wait to the headline risk and look at the fundamentals and show that this company is highly undervalued, but the stock is being manipulated. So we're trying to bring the investors, individual investors, or people who follow us, top-notch research. Everything we said has been pretty accurate. We talked about the pending settlements. We talked about the chatter in Tennessee and the chatter in New York, and now it's going away. We talked about the fact that Endo's probably buying back shares. The trading patterns suggest Endo's buying back shares, and it should be buying back shares hand over fist at these levels. If I was management, I would have bought back half the float right now.
Yeah,
because you basically every dollar you put into your own stock, you're going to get it back tenfold in 6 to 9 months, and we'll know more in November. But everything we've said has come true. Now you're seeing, we talked about generic Chantix for weeks. They finally launched generic Chantix and the stock rose. And now you're seeing California saying the same thing we've said for months, that everybody have known, lawmakers, FDA, the public has known that doctors were prescribing opiates for chronic pain, which is one of the reasons why the prescriptions balloon. And even if you cut supply, you won't be able to necessarily reduce drug-related deaths, drug overdose deaths, or opiate-related drug overdose deaths, because cutting supply doesn't deal with the demand side. So everything we said has been pretty accurate. We've been continuing to give you Monday morning's news on Friday afternoon. So,
there you go.
I'll give Mr. Mitchell one last parting shot.
Yeah, I would just say that, one of the things that we haven't talked about, we're going to talk about it a lot offline. We watch the Fed pretty closely. We're, in my opinion, I think we're going to see a cascade worse than 08, 09 with the Fed, with the Fed's decision to stop QE, although it's a nuanced conversation. But the long and short is that, unfortunately, what was only supposed to go on for 2 or 3 years has gone on for about 13 years. So now you've painted and created a situation where now you kind of have to continue the bad financial practices in order to keep the country afloat, frankly. And the reason that that's relevant is because now we see the Fed doing the thing that they were supposed to do 8 years ago, 9 years ago, and they're doing it now. But the difference between today and, a decade ago is that student loan debt was not surpassing mortgage debt. Auto loan debt was not at the same rate as student loan and mortgage debt. Credit card debt, consumer debt, corporate debt was not at these insane levels. So unlike when Geithner and Hank Paulson were able to find some type of light breaking through what seemed like a complete darkness and use the little bit of wiggle room as far as a solution, whether folks agree with the solution or not. That's not the point. The point is that the country was in a slightly, and I do mean slightly, better position than it 10 years ago, or at this point 13 years ago, than it is today. Why is that important to note? It's because when we look at the reasons, what is the causation? When you look at an opioid crisis, there have been economists, sociologists, anthropologists, even historians that have chimed in. When we look at addiction, what causes addiction? And there is countless scholarship, especially within the Black community, by especially non-Black scholars that have tied poverty and crime hand in hand, poverty and addiction hand in hand. We have literally about 100 years worth of scholarship making that connection. So in other words, look at the picture that is being painted and understand it very clearly, that the Fed is now pulling the rug that has been supporting markets, that have kept asset prices completely spiked during a time when folks are already struggling. The reason that folks were turning to opioids is not simply because they had car accidents or surgeries and dealing with pain, but because they're dealing with stagnating wages, because they're dealing with spiked asset prices. They can no longer afford to send even their brightest children to school. When you have, and understand, even the Wall Street Journal just did, I think a couple weeks ago, did an expose showing, and we've even talked about it on Trump and the GE a few years ago, that these endowment funds are nothing but hedge funds disguised as educational outlets. When you have Yale, one of the largest endowment funds in the country, north of $100 billion. And now it is trickled to a point that even community colleges are picking up endowment funds and trying to get in the game, so to speak. You look at the rate of tuition, 24% increase year over year. So in other words, when you already had a situation where life was being pushed at its furthest reaches in terms of being able to afford said life, and now you have the Fed pulling the rug from under the very system that they've largely created, along with these folks in finance that are just getting goo gobs of money for free, while taxpayers are the ones that are holding the bill. Understand, what do you think that's going to do to the opioid crisis? So mark my words that we will see a worsening of the opioid crisis. So this would be my call to state AGs that wrap it up, and wrap it up quickly. Get into a global settlement ASAP, because states and counties across this country are going to need the resources to address what is getting ready to happen in the next 24 months. This is not time for political fodder. This is not time for political climbing. Get a deal done. Get the resources in states' hands, because it's not going to get any better than it is today. And the money that you're hoping for is also not going to be there, because guess what? These publicly traded companies, even with spiked asset prices, they are still subject to market changes and market fluctuations.
Right.
So $1 billion company may not remain as $1 billion company the next week, the next quarter, the next month, the next year. So it is not guaranteed, nor is it promised. So take this time to wrap these things up ASAP, because the thing that you may not be considering is that this country is potentially heading into an economic winter. And I shudder at the idea that the U.S. can easily turn into a Venezuela. But as far-fetched as that may sound, when you look at the reality, you realize that it is not as far-fetched. So yeah, that would just kind of be my last 2 cents on how serious this is. It is not simply, for political talking points or something to be debated even over YouTube. This is real life for real folks that need real changes and real solutions. And it's really time to provide it. And that's really,
okay, Torian, can you hear me?
What it just kind of boils down to. So that would be my, my little 2 cents. My 2 cents one.
Can you hear me? Jesus Christ.
Did we? Oh, I think we may have lost you, Ralph. So you know what? We'll just wrap up. I think we're having a little bit of technical difficulties. Apparently, I'm having speech difficulties as well. But we'll go ahead and sign off. I'm Mr. Mitchell at Shock Exchange as every week with Trump and the GE. Please make sure that you like, share, and subscribe. Please feel free to also throw out any questions you may have. As I stated, we love questions. We love hearing feedback from you all that do engage with us. And we will try to get some of those questions answered during any one of the broadcasts as well. So again, this is Trump and the GE. Like, share, and subscribe. And we will see you all next week. Take care now.